G'day, Starlo here with the second instalment of my Tuesday chat, brought to you by CM Partners Accounting, who I'll tell you a little bit more about later on. But right now I've just poured myself a rather nice single malt whiskey. So cheers. In the first instalment of these Tuesday chats, I reminisced about some of my earliest fishing memories and told you about the first fish that I caught in both freshwater and saltwater. If you missed that first episode, I'll put a link to it up here and also in the description down below. And I'm making a playlist of all these Tuesday chats. And by the way, as well as sitting and watching them, you can listen to them as a podcast if you'd rather consume them that way. Anyway, in part one, I worked through my early days as a fishing writer, writing my first article and sending it off and actually getting it accepted, and then ultimately ending up becoming first assistant editor and then editor of Fishing World magazine, working with my idol, Ron Calcutt. I brought us right up to 1984 in that first episode, the time when I made the rather rash decision to leave the security of a full-time job with Fishing World and go out on my own as a freelance. Perhaps not my smartest decision, especially not with a young family at the time. Put it this way, we ended up eating a lot of fish. It was pretty hard to pay the bills on a freelance income. It still is. We were living in the eastern suburbs of Sydney at the time, and I didn't even have a car. We couldn't afford one. But I used to walk or catch the bus down to the rocks and mostly fish for blackfish or luderick off the rocks using centerpin gear and greenweed under a float. And my gosh, we ate a lot of those blackfish. In that first episode, I also told you about my unforgettable trip to Canada in October 1981 when I got to compete in the Air Canada Tuna Cup, representing Australia against 21 or 22 magazine editors from all over the world, and I was lucky enough to catch the biggest fish, that massive 1,020 pound Atlantic bluefin tuna, the biggest fish I'll ever catch in my life. Well, the publicity generated by that event certainly went down well with the Canadian consulate and their tourism department, because I got an invite back just a year or two later, this time to compete in a salmon fishing tournament out of Campbell River on Vancouver Island. The base for this tournament was a fantastic old establishment called Painter's Lodge, really famous, and the dining room in Painter's Lodge had all these photos all over the wall of politicians and actors and actresses who'd been there and gone fishing out of Painter's Lodge over the years. I spent hours just poring over those photos on the wall. You know, the sad fact is that not all that long after I was there for that competition, Painter's Lodge burnt down and all of that history was lost. It's a real shame. My fellow team member for the salmon tournament was a guy by the name of Paul Barker, who some of you might remember, a really good fly fisherman, particularly saltwater fly, and he had a very popular column in Modern Fishing at the time. Paul and I had been invited over there to represent Australia, again against a number of other countries, mostly magazine writers and editors. The whole idea was to promote the salmon fishing out of Campbell River on Vancouver Island. And what we were fishing for was Chinook or king salmon, but not when they're running up the rivers to spawn. Instead, when they're actually out in the ocean, feeding on the massive schools of herring that those waters are so famous for. And the way we fished for them was really interesting. It's called mooching. It involves using a fairly long parabolic rod and a direct drive centerpin knuckle duster style reel, a bit like we'd use for blackfish. So Paul and I were paired up and we'd go out each day in a boat with a local skipper or guide, fairly small boats, and we'd go out into the channel and the tide absolutely rips through there. There's actually whirlpools and all sorts of stuff. And the rig we were using is called a cut plug herring rig. They actually get one of the herring and slice the herring and they rig it up on two hooks, believe it or not, so that it actually spins in the water. Exactly what most of us spend the rest of our lives trying to make our baits not do. But for some reason, these Chinooks really like a herring that's spinning. Now, because the tide runs so hard, you use a fairly big sinker to get your line down to the level where the Chinook salmon are feeding. Now, from memory, I don't think these boats had depth sounders or anything. They were pretty basic. But those guys, they were mostly local commercial fishers that were running the boats. They really knew their salmon. So they'd take us out to an area where they knew the salmon were feeding, and they'd make an estimate about how deep they reckon the salmon were schooling at the time. And the idea was you'd let your line down to that depth. Now, as I said, no depth sounders, no line counters on the reel. So what they'd say to you is 55 pulls. So that was a pull from the reel to the stripper guide, and you do 55 of them. That'd get your sinker and baited rig down to the depth where they reckon the salmon were feeding. I'll never forget, on the first morning we got out there and the guy said 55 pulls, and I did it and sent my rig down. And because the sinker's so heavy, that soft rod actually had quite a bend in it when I got to the desired depth. And I said to the guide, how am I going to know when I get a bite? And he said, oh, your tip will do what it's doing now. And what it did was, it went from being bent like that to straight, because the salmon had eaten my bait and was coming up through the water column, and it had actually taken the weight of the sinker off the line. So I wound into it, whoa, and I had him on. And I tell you what, they fight really hard. I'd reckon almost as hard as a yellowtail kingfish, certainly as hard as a big snapper. Lots of runs, lots of head shakes. They were fish anything from about 7 or 8 pound up to 15, 16, 17, 18 pound. So pretty solid salmon. And bright chrome silver coming out of the salt water like that. Beautiful fish. Well, a lot of the competitors from other countries really struggled with that mooching gear. They'd never used a direct drive centre pin reel or a long soft rod like that. Paul and I had a major advantage. He, of course, was a really good fly fisherman, and this gear is not that different to fly gear, especially when you're actually fighting the fish. And I'd grown up using Alvey sidecasts, and I was using them all the time off the rocks back home, as well as fishing for blackfish with centre pin reels. So we took to it like ducks to water, and I've got to say, we did really well. In fact, we won the competition. As an interesting aside, on one of the hookups on those salmon, I actually broke the long rod. It snapped in about the middle as I set the hook. It must have had some sort of damage to the blank, I think. The guide was sure I'd lost the fish, but I still had it on. And interestingly, I ended up landing it in about half the time using half the rod. It was almost like fighting it on a short stroker style of blue water rod. But gee, those fish went hard. And again, I think Canadian tourism were pretty pleased with our efforts and the articles that we generated from that trip, because only a year or two later I got another invite back to Canada, this time to go to Reindeer Lake in northern Saskatchewan, right out in the prairies of central Canada and way up north where it gets covered in metres of snow during the winter. But we were up there in summertime, and it was actually quite warm by their standards. And the other thing no one tells you about places like northern Canada is that during the short, sharp summer, the bugs are out of control. Mosquitoes and black flies, they're everywhere. They bite you. The black flies in particular, they actually chew a little piece out of your skin. Not very pleasant at all. So you've either got to lather up with repellent or wear some sort of face shield when you're fishing. This time I was fishing with a lovely guy called Italo Labignan. Now, Italo and his business partner Henry Woschuk were the Rex Hunts of Canada. They had a really high profile on cable TV. They used to speak at the sportsman shows, and they had a massive following in Canada. Italo and I were supposed to be competing against each other in this event at Reindeer Lake, but we actually got on like a house on fire, and we really enjoyed each other's company and fishing together for northern pike and lake trout. And we caught plenty of them too. The most exciting part for me was fishing surface lures, topwater lures for the northern pike. And I've still got one mounted on the wall of my office. An 18-pounder that I caught during that trip. I'll never forget that. So much fun. We'd fish out of a boat with a guide during most of the day, and the days are very, very long up in far northern Canada at that time of the year. So we'd come back late in the afternoon. There'd still be hours of light left, and I'd go for a wade around the shores quite close to the lodge with my fly gear and catch mostly smaller pike. They call them jack pike when they're only sort of up to about 70 or 80 centimetres long, fairly skinny. Really good fun. I was just chucking bucktail flies and stripping them fairly quickly and smacking these things, and I was wading out up to my waist. And there were quite a few American clients staying at the lodge, and you got to remember this was right about the time that Crocodile Dundee was a really big hit. The movie had taken off all over the world, and Paul Hogan was also doing ads for Foster's beer on the TV over there at the time, and Foster's was and still is really big in Canada. Anyway, these Americans had come down and watched me fly fishing for the pike, and I didn't realise, I got so carried away with catching the pike that I forgot about the black flies, and they'd all crawled up inside my hat, and they were actually chewing on my scalp. And I didn't realise till I looked in the mirror later, but I actually had blood running out from under my hat while I'm catching these pike, and the Yanks were blown away. They nicknamed me Jackfish Dundee, and they'd come down every afternoon to watch me fly fishing for these pike. It was a great trip, a lot of really wonderful memories. So those 3 trips to Canada, the tuna one, the salmon trip, and then the one to Reindeer Lake in northern Saskatchewan, they really cemented a love for Canada in me. It's got a lot of similarities to Australia. It's a big country with not a huge population. The population all tend to live along the edges. Of course, the climate's very different, but the people and their approach to life are quite similar, and I really enjoyed Canada. Well, I hadn't been back long from that trip when Italo contacted me and asked me if I'd like to come back and live in Canada and become the founding editor of Canadian Sport Fishing magazine, which was a magazine that he and Henry had decided to launch to back up their TV and sportsman show presence and build on their media empire. Well, I mulled it over for a fair while, and eventually I decided to bite the bullet, uproot my wife and young family and take them all to Canada. It's quite an experience relocating to another country, I can tell you. And I've also got to admit that we were pretty homesick. The endless winter, the higher cost of living, and the fairly low wage that I was on as editor of the brand new magazine all kind of conspired to mean that we only stayed there for a bit over a year before coming back to Australia. But my gosh, I learnt a lot in that year. As you can imagine, I fished at every possible opportunity for everything from largemouth and smallmouth bass to muskies and pike and all the various trout, of course. And I learnt so much during that year in Canada, particularly about what I like to call finesse fishing, and also fishing with some styles of lures that really hadn't taken off back in Australia at this point. Things like spinner baits and particularly soft plastics. So I came back to Australia knowing a lot more about those things than I did when I left for my 1-year sabbatical in Canada. So I lobbed back in Australia at the very end of the 1980s, and I needed to find a way to feed the family. I did various jobs. At one stage I was actually the sub-editor of a TV gossip magazine called TV Soap. We were actually living in Bowral on the Southern Highlands at the time, and I'd commute every day by train into the city and work on this TV Soap magazine. And I'd get all these news stories out of the US about the soapy stars and the movie stars, and I had to turn them into Australianese for TV Soap magazine. It was an interesting job. I didn't last too long doing that though. I needed to find a way to make a living out of my passion, and I was struggling to do it. And as fate would have it, I got a phone call one day from one of the producers of the very first series of Rex Hunt shows on TV, and he asked me if I'd be keen to take Rex for a fish for the cameras. Well, yeah, I said that'd be absolutely fantastic. And that was the beginning of a decade on the Rex Hunt show, working with people like the wonderful Bushy. But anyway, I'll save that for the next episode. We'll talk about the Rex Hunt years in episode 3 of these Tuesday chats, which, as I said before, are brought to you by CM Partners Accountants. Now look, I've just recently signed up with CM Partners to do all my bookkeeping and tax stuff, and I'm really finding them a joy to work with. If you're a small business owner or a tradie and you despair of finding an accountancy firm that'll actually listen to you and talk to you like a human being, well, try CM Partners. Seriously, they're in a different league. If you use the Starlo link in the description down below, they'll give you a free and obligation-free consultation about doing your books and accountancy. Well worth checking out. All right, well, I've been doing more talking than drinking. So until next time, cheers and tight lines, and I'll catch you next Tuesday for another chat. Remember, if you're enjoying these, give us a thumbs up down below. I'm enjoying doing them. I hope you're enjoying watching them. Cheers for now.